Today's episode of the Fancy Scientist podcast was inspired by a tweet, or actually, it came about because of a tweet. You just never know what's going to happen on social media. So here's what happened. Here's the backstory. There was a news story that went viral about people in North Carolina who took baby bear cubs that they spotted, wild baby bear cubs, from a tree to take selfies with them. This is something I really care about because even on episode, I believe as early as episode number 2, I talked about animal selfies. So this is something I have been caring about for a long time. And I learned that scientists taking photos of themselves with animals in a selfie like matter with primates actually was a contributing factor to people wanting to do this kind of behavior. So I created a tweet asking scientists to stop doing this. This has been a pet peeve of mine for some time because we don't want to encourage people to either participate in something that negatively harms wildlife, either the wild animals, or there are tourism operations where you can do this and they're very unethical. They have very poor animal welfare practices. Anyways, I wrote a tweet about this and posted it. And this tweet did pretty well. I haven't been super active on Twitter, and this one really took off. And one of the people who responded to this tweet was Dr. Cassie Freund. And she was like, that was my paper, the primate paper. So I invited her to be on this podcast so that we could talk about researchers taking pictures with their animals and how the public views them, what we can do as researchers to still have effective science communication, but also ensure that we're doing good things for wildlife, because that's the whole reason why we are in this profession. Cassie is the director of science communication at the Frost Museum in Miami, Florida. So we talk a lot about science communication in addition to her research on animal selfies. She also has lots of fieldwork experience, especially in Borneo on orangutans, and we talk about that as well. This is a super important issue. Make sure to share it with your scientist friends. And I just love and care about this issue so much. So let's just get started. Hi, Cassie. Welcome to the Fancy Scientist podcast. I'm so excited to have you here today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So, you are invited to the podcast because you responded to a tweet that had been pretty successful. I haven't been on Twitter a whole ton lately, but this tweet was about a story that went viral of a few people in North Carolina who had taken a bear cub from a tree. I'm so surprised they didn't get attacked by the mama bear. I don't know where she was. But they took a bear cub from a tree and they decided to do selfies with the bear cub. And then I had a tweet telling scientists not to do selfies with their study subjects. And I talked about a research study that showed in primates that then this can promote regular people wanting to do either bad practices like this one, but more often illegal or not illegal operations, legal operations, but aren't the most ethically friendly towards wildlife, usually cub and bear petting or holding. So can you tell us about your research paper and your research in general that had to do with primates and this whole subject?
That's right. Yes, actually, a lot of this work kind of about the impact of media and social media has been done with primates. The history, like there was a man named Stephen Ross who was at Lincoln Park Zoo. He passed away, a couple of years ago, unfortunately, but he really was like a force for getting chimpanzees out of the media,
Mhm.
like commercials, TV. And him and some of his colleagues did some of like the earliest, I think, work on this, looking at how chimpanzees, if you show them in pictures with people or in human kind of settings, people are less likely to believe that those animals are endangered and they're more likely to believe this host of other things that are really bad for conservation. And so, kind of inspired by this and my history of working in orangutan conservation, I actually spent several years working in Borneo with a couple of different orangutan and rainforest conservation organizations. And I saw the way that different groups kind of marketed themselves. And I started wondering with my colleague, Andrea DiGiorgio, what is the impact of this?
Mm.
And so we've done a couple of different studies. The most recent one, we actually looked at how the impact of posting images of a human interacting or even just in the same frame with a primate and posting that with and without a caption saying that I'm doing this work with permission, essentially. So we set up this experiment because we see scientists do this. Regular people do it too. People go to these kind of legal but less reputable zoos and stuff that you were talking about, or they go on vacation and they participate in these animal selfie opportunities. So people do this, but scientists are also guilty of doing it, posting images of themselves with their study species. And so that's what we aimed to test. So we had this control image where the caption was simply me with my study species. And then we had an experimental where it was the same image, the same beginning of the caption, but then it was followed up by saying all animals are handled with proper permission and training. This is the way that we have seen scientists try to mitigate some of the conservation harms when they post images of themselves with these animals on social media. And basically what we found is that those captions, they don't do anything. So people are more likely to perceive the image as showing research activities, but they are not less likely to want to interact with that animal themselves, is
So
basically what we found.
the caption part is not surprising, but the photo itself, it's still like a selfie type photo, or is it more like a research photo?
So we had two images that we used. We tested both using the same setup I just described. The first one was of a man. This was a Getty stock photo, right? Is a man wearing kind of plain clothing that a researcher type person would wear, sitting about 4 meters from a gorilla, but in the same frame. And then the second image that we tested and found the exact same results basically was a image of a person. There in the image, it was mostly just their torso, but they were handling a small primate. It was a loris. They were handling it. They were wearing gloves, but they were still touching it. And we found the same thing, like I said.
Wow. So would your recommendation be that scientists not take pictures at all with animals or study subjects? And just to back
Yes.
And just to backtrack a little bit, that yeah, you're correct that regular people go around the world and you especially traveling internationally where the laws are a lot more relaxed, you can find somebody with a monkey and get your picture taken with a monkey. And I'm sure there are some scientists that do this too, but for the most part when scientists do it, they have research permits, and in the case of the black bears are kind of unusual in that when scientists study them, they part of their research involves going to the den where the mother is hibernating. They pull out the cubs to weigh the cubs, and they actually have to hold the cubs as part of their work to keep the cubs warm. And then that's the opportunity to take the selfie. And that those again, like very much do not look like research photos, even though they are. But from what you said, it doesn't matter. So is there ever a case when scientists can take an ethical photo or a photo that's not going to promote this practice with their study subject?
Yeah. So that's a tough question. I said no right off
Yeah,
the bat. There's a few caveats to that. So I think these images are okay to take and not share publicly.
correct.
If a scientist wanted to use them in a research presentation where they're talking to other scientists who understand the whole context, I think that's okay. And we have not tested this with other animals. So we haven't done the same experiment with non primate animals. We are working on a project doing something similar with a big cat photo. We do not know about bears, although I mean, just based on what happened in North Carolina, it's tempting to say that perhaps bears are like primates in that regard. We don't know, but there's, this thing in scientists talk about the precautionary principle where if you don't know how something's going to turn out, you shouldn't do it.
Hmm.
I think that's the case here. Like, even though we don't know for sure how people perceive these images of big cats or bears or birds. I think personally we should just stay away from posting those kinds of images on social. And it's hard, right? There's all kinds of reasons why people want to post those pictures.
Mhm.
But if we're really concerned about these animals and their conservation, I think that we have to stop.
Yeah, I totally understand that. And I totally understand also that it hasn't been tested, but given that there's so many cub petting operations with big cats especially, but I've also seen bears, it's likely to transfer over. So you are the director of science communication at Frost Science, which obviously means you care a lot about science communication. So what can scientists do then to tell these great stories to get people interested in wildlife without touching them? Because I see this all over, even nature documentaries. I have this new show coming up in my feed all the time, and the scientists are constantly handling animals of all different kinds.
That's a good question. I'm actually pulling up our paper because we do have some language that talks about this at the end. So I think say a few things. Number one is that for primates in particular, there is a set of guidelines produced by the IUCN Primate Specialist Group. They have a section for human primate interactions, and they have derived these best practice guidelines for responsible images of non-human primates. So if someone is studying primates, I urge them to go read those guidelines. They
Mhm.
do a great job of spelling out how to take a good picture of your primate study subject without endangering them. Generally, take pictures of them in their wild habitat.
Mhm.
The problem is, right, the depicting of the human content. And I think, again, haven't tested, but I think that no matter what you write in that caption, it's the image that stays in people's brain. It's not the words you say. That's actually what our next project is going to test. Is there a way that you can write captions to mitigate some of that harm? But my hypothesis is that it's picture that really matters.
Mhm.
So I, that's a key thing. And I will say, I was pulling up our past study because we had some nice citations at the end of folks talking about how actually you can achieve similar impact without using those images. So, yes, there are some science communication potential benefits of using pictures of people interacting with primates. It can be a way to talk about why those animals are endangered. It can be a way to talk about why you, if you're a researcher, study them, how you do your work. But another study that we cite here said that including a human in the frame of a wildlife images does not significantly increase engagement. So you can basically engage similar numbers of people without those pictures.
Wow, that's actually really surprising because I feel like I don't have photos of me with I'm trying to think I'm definitely not holding mammals. I do have a picture of me with an elephant, but the elephant I'm clearly in a car and the elephant's in the background. I do have a picture of me with a bear where you can't even see the bear. The bear is so far away. Or again, I'm in a car with a zebra. But I always felt that the animal pictures brought more attention to my social media feed. But that's interesting that it's not necessarily that way. Or it isn't that way.
That's what they found. That's what they found, and specifically engagement. So not necessarily views. More people might look at that picture
Mhm.
of you with the animal, but in terms of engaging like meaningfully with it, this study found it.
So engagement would count as like likes and comments?
And it's so hard, right? You just talked about these pictures that you can think of that you've been in.
Mhm.
I went shark tagging a few months ago and I have pictures of myself, handling a shark. Where's the line? I don't know. I want to show people those pictures. I
Yeah.
I'll be honest, like I briefly posted them on my Instagram and then I was like, but wait a minute. I study this, even though no one is trying to get a tiger shark for a pet. Like, should I really be posting this? And I took it down.
You're underestimating Americans. There probably is somebody
Sure.
trying to get tiger sharks as their pet.
Sure thing. Yeah. And we don't know. There's documentaries. Is the conservation benefit of a wildlife documentary, does it outweigh people potentially misinterpreting a
Yeah.
frame of it? We don't know. There's so much work to do in this realm.
Yeah, and it's also especially confusing because, as you mentioned in the beginning, we had TV, and TV was very controlled. There were gatekeepers, so you could start a campaign pretty easily and be like, we don't want to see chimpanzees in clothes. We want to see them in wild settings to promote conservation messages. But now with social media, like anyone can post anything, And then the institutions are also changing too. Whereas instead of like zoos or circuses, especially abroad, people visit sanctuary. And a lot of these sanctuaries, like for elephants, it'll literally be the same elephants. Like people are against elephant riding, or some groups of people are against elephant riding. And it'll be literally be the same elephants. And one day they're at a sanctuary, and another day they're going for elephant rides with a different type of consumer that is okay with elephant riding. So it's confusing. And even for me as a scientist, sometimes when I'm traveling, I want to do wildlife encounters, and it can be really confusing as well. So, but
It
yeah,
is confusing. They're just a really famous to me because I've been kind of in the orangutan conservation world, but there's a researcher called Liana Chua, and in one of her papers, she talks about the story of someone who wanted to adopt an orangutan, right? So the orangutan rehabilitation centers that you can adopt, it's usually unspoken that this is a virtual adoption, right? You're sending the money to care for the
Mhm.
animal, but someone actually called and was like, when do I get my baby orangutan? And it seems like a wild thing to ask. And on the other hand, if you don't know, if you're not aware about the
Mhm.
dangers these animals face and how rare they are, like you can't blame that person.
Right. Yeah. And it's also hard for us as scientists to be like, to other people, like, "Oh, you shouldn't be doing that," but then we're doing it. Yes, we have permits, and we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't have permits, but we're also doing it, and we want to do it. I mean, this is the reason why we choose this job, is because we want to be close to wildlife. We want to study them. Yeah, do you have any comments on that?
No, I mean, I think you hit it right on the head. It's like in this situation, scientists who post kind of pictures are basically saying, do as I say, but not as I do.
Yeah.
And expecting everyone to understand the context of what it means to be a scientist and how hard it is to get these permits and how long you have to train to be allowed to handle these animals. Most people don't know that.
Mhm.
How would they? And again, that's where I think we have to stop posting these pictures.
And then also, they don't understand all of the, I mean, paperwork that we have to go through, but the explanation of how we handle animals. Because as I mentioned, we start off, like people are really driven to be close to wildlife, but in your training, you learn that this is really stressful for the animals. So, really, to be the best scientist possible, both from an ethical perspective of reducing the stress on wildlife, but also from a bias, because if you're inducing temporary stress on wildlife through anesthetizing them, putting the collar on them, it could change the results for science as well.
That's right. And there's scientists who study just that, right? What is the effect of
Mhm.
catching these animals? What is the effect of even monitoring them with drones? There are people who think about this, and it's really important. I think we need more of it.
Can you tell us about your background and how you got involved in this field? And it sounds like if you're working on shark tagging, and I know you work at Frost Science, and now you have orangutan work. It sounds like you've had so much incredible experience. So tell us how you got involved first in this study of primate photos, and then how you just got involved in this profession as a whole.
Yeah, so I did a bachelor's in biology. I have a master's in conservation biology. While I was doing my master's, I got just kind of picked up by another graduate student who was working in Indonesia, and I ended up going with her to do some research on trees. I am more of a rainforest ecologist than an animal biologist. I would not call myself an animal biologist, but I'm a conservationist kind of, at heart. And so anything that needs saving, I'm happy to study it. But I went with her. I studied these Indonesian swamp rainforests. It's really amazing kind of ecosystems. And then I kept going back for a while. Anyone who has ever kind of worked in Indonesia maybe understand that place has like this weird hold on people. We just keep going back. And so I worked in orangutan conservation for several years until I'd started my PhD. I did my PhD on rainforests in Peru, just kind of this total, not a 180, but we'll call it a 90-degree turn. And while I was doing my PhD, I got into science writing and editing other people's science writing. I was working for this website called Massive Science, which was this really amazing program. It is unfortunately shut down because the money ran out. But what we did was we actually trained scientists, most of whom were grad students, in writing for the public.
Mm.
So I wrote a few pieces. Became an editor eventually and helped train other graduate students. And that gave me all these science communication tools like fact checking, copy editing, how to tell a good story that remains, it's still accurate, but it has a narrative, which is difficult skill. And so when I finished my PhD, I applied very broadly to jobs, everything from kind of doing science at a zoo to working for NGOs. And I landed at Frost Science as the director of science communication. And this place is a combination science museum, aquarium, which is how the shark tagging thing came in, and planetarium. And so every day I don't spend a lot of time thinking about rainforests at the moment. I wish I had more time to do that, but I'm thinking about different areas of science that I don't get to, in my research. I get to talk about space, I get to talk about marine conservation, human health, stuff like that. And then this whole research about how animals are shown on media, in the media and social media, has become, it's like a side project, but now that I'm not going to the field so much to study rainforests, it's really my main project. And I'm so excited about it because there's so much that we don't know. And I think that it can do a lot of good.
Yeah, absolutely. And social media is so important nowadays. I mean, that's how people get their information. So it definitely has a huge effect, and we need to know how to use it to maximize the ethical welfare and conservation of species.
Yeah. Again, there's just, so much we don't know too. And there's a lot of opportunity. And we're using tools now like, machine learning, different kinds of AI. We're finding new ways to collect data from social media, which can be tricky, right? There's ethical things we have to keep in mind when we're doing that. It's really exciting to figure out all these different methods of gathering data. I don't know if your average person is aware of just how much you can get off of social media, even just from looking at one post.
Yeah,
You can
tell
see
us.
what's happening in the picture. Yeah, you can look at the picture and say, what's happening in this picture. You can look at the number of comments, the number of likes, the way the caption's written, the hashtags they use on certain platforms, how many times it's shared. You can get all of that just from a single post. Now, not all platforms are conducive to this, right? They all have their own terms of service and stuff like that. And we are very careful to mind those and
Hmm.
stay within the bounds of what's allowed. And because it can be so limiting sometimes, you can't really get a bunch of Instagram data without paying a lot of money. We
Mm.
do experiment instead. We create mock Instagram posts and we make a survey and we get 3,000 people to take it and see what they tell us. So there's all kinds of ways that we can do this. It just requires, some creativity.
I'm curious, how do you deal with the variability of social media or the confounding effects? Like, just as an individual user, I'm always trying to see like what works and what doesn't work. And maybe with your experiments, you have multiple accounts that you're working with, but I only have my account. And maybe one post will work really well one day, and I'll do a similar post 2 weeks later and it doesn't work that well. And I'll always wonder, like, oh, is it the time of day? I'm not very good at standardizing that. But even so, it's like if I Monday 2 weeks later, what if it was a holiday in the US or just, people are starting to like take off more? You know what I mean? So like how do you control for the confounding effects in social media studies? I just feel like there's so many of them. Or even what happens in the
Yeah,
world
that's
that day. What if there's a major news story or something? The algorithm.
right. No, yeah, it's a really good question. We don't yet, at least, have not really collected say this. So the one study where we collected data, like we'll call it in the wild, I'm doing air quotes, from a social media post was using YouTube,
Mhm.
which videos are kind of findable all the time. And we actually just focused on different orangutan conservation organizations and looked at the comments on those YouTube videos that had built up over several years. And there to kind of deal with disparities between maybe how many times a video has been viewed and stuff, we just make a ratio. So if we're looking
Mhm.
at likes, we just do the ratio of likes to views. And then we get a value that's comparable across videos. We set some limits. So, if the video hadn't been viewed a certain number of, like a threshold number of times, we wouldn't use it. We try to only choose videos that have a certain number of views, maybe like a
Mhm.
thousand. But then by using those kind of ratios, you can be more comparative across different videos. And then the way that we did the captioning study was really just creating our own Instagram posts and taking them. No, we didn't post them on Instagram, but we post them on a different survey platform and
Mhm.
attach the survey to it. So people were only seeing the post that they were randomly assigned to and then answering questions based on it.
That makes sense. Do you also study what makes communication effective for scientists? Like what kinds of things are important in conveying messages? Or do you do any kind of studies like that, or just more about how scientists are using animals in their photos?
Our studies are just restricted to how scientists use animals in their photos. Yeah. I do teach, or at least I have teach a class on sustainability communications for grad students. And
Mhm.
we talk a lot in there about kind of the importance of, and I think this is advice that maybe people have heard before, but you're gonna reach an audience a lot better by telling them a story, maybe wrapping one or two facts up in that short story, than just telling them those two facts. Or worse yet, bashing them over the head with six or seven facts. I always tell, the people I work with at the museum too, it's a lot better to tell people one thing and have them walk away knowing that one thing than tell them seven things and have them not remember any of them,
Mhm.
which happens when someone's just yelling facts at you.
Yeah. Can you give us an example of effective storytelling that you used at Frost Science or any of your other research?
Ooh, yes, but I'm going to have to think about that.
Sounds like an interview question. As I said it, I realized a job interview question.
Yeah, that's, whew, she's thinking. That's actually a tough question. I mean, I'll give you an example just from our recent at the museum. We just had a special exhibition about sharks, which
Mhm.
it was amazing. It was by the Australian Museum, so it was kind of sharks of the Pacific and Pacific Islands cultures and how they interacted with sharks. It was just really great. And we wanted to highlight some of the shark stuff that's happening in Miami. So instead of, just making a list of, here's all the universities that are doing it and here are the things that they're studying, which they're kind of the average person maybe won't absorb any of that because it uses a lot of scientific
Mhm.
words that go right over your head, which is totally understandable. They go over mine too if they're not my field. We instead, chose a story about one of the Miami shark projects that kind of an all women research team. And we had a picture of them in the field. We had, these are small stories, just
Mhm.
single graphics, but a story about the shark teeth found at one of the historical sites just down here in Miami. There was even a little kind of interactive element for kids about shark. We called it shark personalities, but I think personality is a tough word to ascribe to animals. So it's more like about different shark behaviors in different habitats. So it is just telling these really short stories instead of just quoting, research titles to folks.
Mhm.
Adding a picture, making even a historical connection is really fun. Not everyone loves science. Some people love history. Some people love both. So we just try to tell a message in many different ways to reach as many people as we can.
Sounds cool. What do you do at your job as the director of science communication at Frost Science? What kinds of things do you do on a daily basis?
So every day is different. Some days I'm out tagging sharks only once. I went shark tagging with Miss Minorities in Shark Sciences, great organization. I got to go shark tagging with them. Most days I'm here at the museum. I'm helping write exhibit copy. I'm helping, like today, I've spent a lot of time proofreading and fact checking summer camp curriculum. I help copy edit marketing copy to make sure that, there's no typos. Basically, anytime we're talking to the public about science, it has to pass through me to make sure that it's interesting, it's understandable, and it's factual, which is a really key thing, right? Museums and other things, zoos, aquariums, we are all very trusted institutions. And so one of
Mhm.
the most important things is making sure we're getting the science right. Over time, science changes and it's okay if things are outdated. But when we're writing new stuff, we double and triple check to make sure it's worded just right, the numbers are right, we have sources for everything because we want to make sure we're getting people the best information.
And that's especially hard when talking about museums. I used to work at a museum when you're dealing with like a placard. And I remember in lab meeting one time, we were talking about the Yellowstone wolf story. And there's a lot of research coming out where, the story was wolves, the introduction of wolves caused this trophic cascade, which affects, like a bunch of species, which then later changes the course of rivers. That was like the basic story, but said even shorter than that on one placard.
Yep.
And so a scientist, I think, wrote a paper about it, about how like this wasn't accurate anymore. And we were talking about how difficult, like, how do you take a story like that and account for all of the caveats but still capture the essence? And when I was writing a book for kids on earth science, I had prompts from the publisher about certain things to include, and it was so hard to come up with, like, how do you describe volcanoes in like less than 50 words? And it's so hard to get it succinct but also accurate at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, it is a really tough. I often am just asking myself, what is the minimum our audience needs to know to get
Mhm.
this? Maybe if there's 10 caveats, they don't need to know all 10. We just need to word it in a way that they would not need to be aware that there's caveats. You know what I mean? It is an art form and it takes a lot of practice.
So it sounds like you're not the one who is working on social media. This sounds like you take other people's content or talk to the scientist directly and try to find the story and create a cohesive storyline for the museum, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's more along those lines. So our marketing team actually handles our social
Mhm.
media content. I will check things for them often, when they have questions. But more often, yes, my job is talking to scientists. Usually just reading the science is enough because usually again, the stories we tell are short. People in a museum don't always have 5 minutes to stand and read something, right?
Mhm.
Their one kid is running away, their other kid wants a snack. They just need to read something in 50 words, like you say. So we distill it down, hit the high points, and they're on their way.
Sounds like a cool job. And I have a lot of people in my audience who are interested in jobs. It sounds like you're doing research as part of your job with Frost Science. And is that official? Is that something that they encourage? Like when you were hired, were they like, we want you to publish? Because when I worked at a museum and I applied for a job, they did want you to publish. It was more of a research position, but still the publication metrics weren't super high. So it's interesting to know that as director of science communication that you are publishing and conducting research. Is that something you brought into the position or they encourage you to do?
It is something I brought into the position. The social media stuff I don't do at the museum. That's actually kind of in my nights and weekends. I have a great team of people that I work with, including students who someone's just now walking in. Anyway, I have a good team of people I work with, including students who can do a lot of the work. I am sometimes more of a guiding force and also kind of designing the experience for them to then kind of take. But yeah, that's my nights and weekends. I do research at the museum. It's actually all the stuff I've done here is marine science focused. So
Mhm.
that's a whole other thing that I've learned. So we've published, or, it's in press, review of the museum's conservation volunteer work. We are just about to submit a study where we surveyed a bunch of museum guests to ask what they know and how they feel about the coral reef here in Florida.
Mhm.
And I also have another project that's been like slow going, but I've been working with some of the aquarists because they did some really interesting work with a mantis shrimp. And in zoos and aquariums, those kinds of interesting stories don't always get told because they're not part of anyone's job. So I kind
Mhm.
of made it my job, and we're going to work on sharing that too.
And mantis shrimp are all the rage these days. They're very
They're
popular.
super cool, amazing animals, handle with care.
Yeah. Wasn't a YouTube video that made them quite popular? Like, didn't a YouTube video go viral and about their strength?
I think so. I think so. Yeah.
And going back to the original reason behind this talk, like talking about animal communication and not using scientists with the animals, There's so many examples of really effective communication. Like I don't this is my unofficial opinion, but I think the most effective, I guess, professionally made science communication in the past few years was Planet Earth. That's the one I think that has been most successful by BBC, that has spread across the United States, reached a lot of just non-scientific audiences. And you never, I think maybe you see David Attenborough a little bit here and there in the series, but it's mostly just visualizations of Earth and the species in it.
I think so too. And I would say great storytelling, right? The episode about animals in cities, we got to see, I forget, it was some kind of big cat, kind of using the same habitats as people. There was kind of a,
Mhm.
ooh, is this a danger? Is it not? There was a really famous, I think it was Planet Earth 2, the chase with the lizards on the beach. Do
Mhm.
you know what I'm talking about?
With the snakes.
That it's a story. Yeah.
And then
They're
also Snoop
telling a
Dogg
story.
redid it. Did you see that?
Yes. Yeah. I think there's some really funny, I'm not on TikTok a lot, but there are some people doing very funny things around animals in a way where they're not the center of the story. And I think that that's great. There's just as many, I think, good examples of this communication as there are bad examples. And I will say, like, if you're someone who's listening to this and you have posted a picture of yourself, holding a bear cub or whatever in the past, don't feel bad because you see it a lot. Like, you just, we all just need to do better.
Mhm.
So it's a lesson learned. You should not feel awful about yourself. You just have to kind of take the lesson and move on and try not to post those things next time. As tempting as it is, I fully acknowledge it's super tempting. Everyone wants to go viral, but keep the reason that you're doing the work in mind. And
Mhm.
that's conserving these animals.
Yeah, we pretty much all have done that or have photos like that. So what if, say, somebody you know is doing that or you don't know? What is the best way to handle that? Like, comment on their post? Because that also could backfire by bringing more attention to their post and spreading it more farther, giving it farther reach. So what would you recommend that people do?
That's a really good question. And I honestly, I don't know the answer. Maybe DM the person if you
Mhm.
can, if their settings allow you. Cause I think saying something privately is going to be a lot more successful than publicly, telling someone that they're doing a bad thing. Some people aren't ready to hear it. Some people think that if they've worded it just right, I'm doing this for educational reasons, that they're just somehow immune to the way that other people perceive their posts. So you will not change people's minds all the time. But I think if you could just send a DM and try and see if they're receptive to it, that's probably the best way to do it.
Yeah, or I always like if I do comment, I always comment in a very polite way. Like, you might not know this, but research shows that this actually encourages people. And then with TikTok, oh, TikTok is like crazy. The second I see something where somebody's like touching animal, I just like flip through it as quickly as possible. So like it doesn't get picked up by the algorithm.
Yeah. And you can, I mean, if it's really egregious, you can report things for animal
That's
abuse.
true. Yeah. So for example, like
Yeah.
I think I've seen people like feed bears. Like it looks like it's a wild black bear. I don't know. I scrolled through it so quickly, but people are feeding it or feeding raccoons. You'll see like 30 raccoons around them. Are there any things you can do for things like that where it's not clearly abuse, but it's misconduct?
Yeah. I don't know. I guess in that situation, if you want to intervene, I would say something more about safety. Honestly, raccoons make me so
Yeah.
nervous and bears too. Uh,
But yeah, bears.
and, but raccoons, like, they're so twitchy. They're still wild animals. Yeah, I think I would appeal to the person's safety. It's not always going to work. And I use the report buttons on social media as like a wishful thinking kind of thing. I figure like I'll just report it and see what happens, even though it probably won't work.
Mhm.
And I've done that recently, reporting something for animal abuse. I think it was an orangutan wearing clothes being
Mm.
forced to perform. I was like, well, let's try. The worst thing that'll happen is my report's ignored. Okay.
Mhm. So for people who don't know, why would you report that as abuse? What is abusive about putting an orangutan in clothes?
It's a great question. And it's the same reason why tiger cub petting is abusive and some of these other kind of roadside attractions. It's because those animals are often drugged or mistreated behind the scenes to get them to behave that way.
Mm.
With primates, if it's a young primate, pretty much the only way that that animal came into someone's hands is that it was taken from the wild. Its mother was killed. It probably saw it happen and it entered into the pet trade, which is like at its root very abusive, right? And they're wild animals and they don't want to be in that situation. So they're suffering just simply by being under human care.
A big argument that people use is for captively bred animals, wild animals. What are your thoughts about that? I don't think that's not allowed to happen for primates, is it? Is that legal?
Not that I'm aware of. It doesn't. So for me, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's nearly impossible to tell if something's captive bred or wild fawn, so to say. I guess you could go and ask someone for all the papers on those animals, but no
Mhm.
one's doing that. So I think it's better to just assume that these animals, assume the worst. And captive breeding is not great either. I think I'm going to caveat that quite a bit. The kind of captive breeding that happens in zoos, zoos and aquariums do it in a very scientific way for meaningful purposes to increase the genetic diversity of those animals so that potentially in the future they can be released back into the wild. That is a special kind of captive breeding that I'm not talking about here when I say that. But the captive breeding that is for commercial or capitalistic
Mhm.
purposes is not good.
Right. And even if they're captive bred for a zoo population, they're not extremely handled by humans. They're handled only to the extent for medical purposes. Like if they need to train a bear, it's so that they will have like extremely minimum contact so that they train a bear to raise its paw so that the vet can look at it, not for tricks or anything like that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly
Yeah.
right. Any human contact is very purposeful for specific
Mhm.
reasons. For the kind of captive breeding that you get, baby tigers for roadside attractions, that's not so. Those animals are most likely, I can't say for sure because I've never been involved in this, but most likely handled from birth.
Mhm.
Again, drugged so they're not exhibiting their natural behaviors, taken from their mothers before they're ready. Pretty, poor consequences for their welfare and their.
Mhm. Yeah, that's what I always tell people the big differences between a captive bred animal, wild animal versus a domestic animal is that domestic animals, they've co-evolved to live with us for tens of thousands of years. Whereas even if that captive animal is tame, even over a couple of hundred generations, it still has all those innate wild instincts. It hasn't changed genetically yet.
That's right. It's dangerous too. Just like flat out, if
Mhm.
no other reason will convince you not to own a wild animal than the fact that it can kill you, that seems like a good one.
I remember, I mean, this is sad, but God, it's been a long time ago now. Like, honestly, maybe 20 years ago now when this woman, it was her friend actually who owned a chimpanzee, and the woman was mauled by it. The woman's friend was mauled by it and like completely disfigured. It was really sad, but and I think the chimpanzee had been there for a very long time. Like she had kept it as a pet for decades, and just one day it snapped or something happened. And yeah, so they're always wild animals.
Yeah. Yeah. They might look like human babies. They might, unfortunately be treated like human babies, but they remain wild and they are extremely strong and they will harm you.
Before we end, I'd love to know about your research in Borneo and orangutans. Can you tell us, or in Indonesia? Was it in Borneo as well? Okay.
It was on Borneo. Yeah. I've
Okay.
worked with the Bornean orangutan. Yep.
Yeah, if you could tell us more about that.
So I've done a few things. So I kind of in the first place I worked, which now goes by Borneo Nature Foundation. They had a different name previously when I was there, but I studied the forest. So we were looking at what the swamp forest there. I think like in other swamp forests, the ground is very uneven. So there's these kind of high points, little hills, and then there's low points in the ground called hollows. And so one thing we did was we looked at which trees grow, which can grow in the low lying parts and which trees can grow on the higher lying parts. And this is variation within just a few feet. It's just the way the ground moves. So that was one thing we looked at with an eye toward, if we know this thing about these tree species, whether they like the low lying or the higher places, can we use them better in forest restoration? That was kind of the goal of that project. And then I spent a couple years directing the conservation work for the Gunung Orangutan Conservation Program, which is this pretty large, multifaceted organization that tackles the problem of orangutan conservation through a bunch of different ways. But two of the projects that I did there, one, we gathered up 10 years of orangutan trade data from the area. So the organization had been monitoring wildlife trade for more than a decade. So we took 10 years of that information and we looked to see if there was any trend in orangutan trade, either spatial trends. So where is this happening, or what we knew about, how it's happening. That was one study. And then I also did something totally different, which was evaluating the effectiveness of the program's environmental education work.
Oh,
So a lot of places do environmental education. It's hard to sometimes know if it's successful. The best way to do that is to, give the people involved a little quiz before and after to see what they learned. So we did some of that too, again, with an eye toward just improving the way that the organization did conservation.
mhm.
Were we telling people the right things? Were we accidentally telling them things that were kind of, disempowering or not motivating? And that kind of stuff it's not necessarily like the flashiest kind of science, but it's so, so important because funds for conservation are limited. You want to make sure that you're having the most impact with the money you spend. And
Mhm.
so it's great to know if you're doing something wrong or if you can improve it in some way so you can reach more people.
I totally agree. And it's not even as much like you're doing something wrong, but like, is it effective? Is what you're doing working? Because
Exactly.
I think as scientists, I think we learn a lot from the deficit model. Like we're like, like when you learn information, then you learn it and you change your opinion based on
Yeah.
information. But a lot of people don't. And like you said, people can only remember certain facts or resonate with certain facts. And it can be the same fact, but the way that you tell it and the story around it that really causes people to think differently or have it stick with them. So you're right. That is so important and not done enough.
I think that we have a study and review that updates all that after more years. I can't even calculate the number of years it's been, maybe like 10 more years since we did that. So we're just gone back and reevaluated all of that to see
Oh, cool.
if they've made, any larger strides since the first time we looked at the effectiveness.
Well, thank you so much. Do you have any last words or like piece of advice for somebody who is interested in going to a career path like yours? What would that be?
A really good question. I'm like thinking about what the most impactful thing will be. Honestly, I think that most places need more fact checkers. So if there's maybe one skill that you could pick up, try to learn how to be an effective checker of facts. And that I think will be a very valuable skill that's in demand wherever you go to work.
Well, thank you so much. I seriously could talk to you about these topics for a very long time. I think they're fascinating and there's so much with social media. So there's so much to investigate. And I look forward to learning more about your research.
Yeah, thanks. Stay tuned. We're just starting this big cat study, but hopefully we'll have some good
Oh.
news. And well, we'll have news no matter what. In maybe 8 months or a year.
Thank you, Cassie, so much for that interview. This is a topic that I hold near and dear to my heart. For previous podcasts and other blog posts on the issue of animal tourism, animal selfies, when Tiger King was happening, I wrote a full series about it. Just check the show notes. You can also follow Cassie on Twitter and Instagram. On Instagram, she is at Dr. Cassie Freund. So it's DrCassieFreund. And on Twitter, she's at Cassie Freund. You can also check the show notes for those links. Thank you so much, guys, for listening. And I encourage you to spread the word about separating yourselves from your study species in your photos when posting them on social media to still conduct effective science communication and doing the best that we can for the animals that we are so desperately trying to protect. Have a great day.